The World We Create, From God to Market, by Tomas Björkman, read by Mark Meadows. When I decided to leave my career as a physicist and instead launched my own business in finance, I started to think about the problem of understanding human society. I began to question what money, right of ownership, and the market really are, and started to realize how the social world in fundamental ways differs from that of nature and physics. In view of my new occupation as a banker, I realized that many of the things I had previously taken for granted and seen as self-evident facts, such as the market, are actually arbitrary social constructions without much anchoring in physical reality. The market is a self-organizing, complex system, but in contrast to life, consciousness, and other biological systems, it is a system that we have created ourselves, virtually without noticing it. We may not see the market as a god, yet by virtue of the power it wields in our personal lives, the way it structures our social reality, and how we tend to ascribe it almost divine magical abilities, it has almost come to behave as one. If we do not gain a better understanding of the mechanisms of the market, if we see it as self-evident and fail to expose the myths surrounding it, the danger is that we will actually allow it to become our new god. The market is a socially constructed phenomenon that only exists in our shared symbol world, Popper's World 3. Only from the perspective of this domain can it be perceived in a meaningful manner. As such, it belongs to a type of phenomena to have emerged at the cultural stage of evolution that made a group of biological creatures capable of creating novel conceptions in their minds and externalizing them in very tangible ways. The market is thus a cultural phenomenon that previous generations have invented. Now, however, it has been institutionalized in our symbolic universe to a degree where it has come to appear to us as part of our objective reality. Rather than just a clever tool to organize society, it has become a social imaginary containing myths and illusions that we see as facts rather than the fictions they really are. If more of us did, we would probably be able to reconstruct it to generate higher levels of efficiency, fairness, and meaning. The illusion of a free market. The market is both a self-organizing complex system and a social construction. Much of the confusion that prevails in the debate about the market today is derived from the failure to realize this dual aspect. In order to think more clearly about the market, both as a self-regulating and socially constructed system, it is important that we distinguish between two sorts of rules, constitutive and regulative rules. To even function as a self-organizing system, there is a need for internal rules to define the feedback mechanisms in the system, or constitutive rules with another word. Without such rules, self-organizing systems cannot exist. The game of football, as an example, cannot exist without constitutive rules to define the objective of the game. In fact, if players did not agree on the rules that football is played by kicking around a ball on a field, that only goalkeepers can use their hands to catch the ball, and that the winning team are those who have kicked it into a goal the most times when the game ends, it simply would not be football. Similarly, if market participants did not agree about the right to own private property, and that only the state can use organized violence to persecute those who violate this right, that economic transactions are to be voluntarily negotiated, and that money is used in the exchange of services and products, the market as we know it could not exist either. These basic conditions are not just certain characteristics of the market, they are the market. A market where no one respects non-coercive monetary transactions is just as little a market as a game where players throw around hockey pucks in a game of football. In addition to these constitutive rules, which are necessary for even starting a game, we can regulate the system with a number of regulative rules. In football, these include rules such as each team consisting of 11 players, matches being played over 2 periods of 45 minutes, and goals being invalid if scored by players who are offside. What characterizes a regulative rule is that it could be different without violating the constitutive rules. A game played by two teams of 7 players for 30 minutes without the offside rule would still be a game of football. It is the same with the market. For example, today the market is governed by a number of regulative rules, such as capital owners being the primary stakeholders in companies, copyrights lasting 70 years after the death of the copyrighted material's creator, and limited natural resources being privately owned. However, as long as the basic constitutive rules are still upheld, a situation where other stakeholders, such as workers, the environment, or the local community, also had legal rights regarding a company, or copyrights were much shorter, or natural resources could only be owned collectively, would still be a market. Constitutive rules define the self-organizing system. Regulative rules the particular ways in which it organizes itself. The constitutive rules are the what, the regulative the how. Even a market free from regulative rules needs constitutive rules to start functioning in a self-organizing manner. Examples of such constitutive rules are property rights and the freedom of market actors to decide the price of their products and services themselves. The outcome of this self-organizing process of the market, Adam Smith's invisible hand, therefore depends on how these constitutive rules have been formulated. A system without private property and extensive price regulations would therefore amount to a very different market than the one we currently have, as different as curling is to football, and hence produce very different outcomes. The way Smith's invisible hand functions simply requires the presence of constitutive rules such as private property and the freedom of individuals to adjust their prices. As such, the invisible hand is not a force of nature. It is not the hand of God, but simply the way in which the system organizes itself from the constitutive rules we ourselves have built into it. Contrary to the constitutive rules of non-random elimination in biology, those of the market have been created by us and can thus be changed if we desire. In nature, self-organizing systems are not governed by deliberate actions and objectives. The laws and regularities in physics and biology are derived from necessity, a certain logic pertaining to the iron law of existence or non-existence. To be or not to be really is the question. But with the social systems of humans, what we want them to self-organize into existence and how is something that we can deliberately influence. There are always external reasons as to why social systems have emerged the way they have. They have all been created by us to fill certain functions in society. Initially, the constitutive rules were created in order to give rise to certain self-organizing processes which at the time were considered desirable. Thereafter, they may have become increasingly self-generating, started to live their own lives, and evolved new complexity through feedback processes with the environment in ways that were often not foreseen to begin with, or even considered desirable later on. As the system organizes itself towards higher complexity, the way it shapes the surrounding world in turn shapes the structure and behavior of the system itself. In a constantly changing world, the degree to which conscious actors successfully adjust the functionality of the system determines how well it keeps generating desirable outcomes. So, just like biological systems, socially constructed ones only survive if they adapt to more complex circumstances. But whereas non-random elimination among organisms ensures the continuous development of new regulative biological functions, and eventually whole new constitutive ones amounting to entirely new species, so as to cope with the increasing complexity of their surroundings, human systems require conscious choices to change how they adapt to the new circumstances. Non-random elimination is, as mentioned earlier, a better choice of words than natural selection to describe the principle of biological evolution, since no one really selects what is to survive or not. Regarding human-made systems, however, someone actually has to select the constitutive and regulative functions to ensure the continuous survival of the system. If we do not make the conscious effort to do so, if we do not select what can naturally, determined by the merciless logic of existence or non-existence, accommodate our system's ability to self-organize patterns generating increased efficiency, justice, and meaning, we will risk elimination non-randomly, that is. Different markets, different regulations. The market is a deeply political creation. Both the internal rules of companies and the external regulations on the market hinge on political decisions that were created under particular circumstances and with the purpose of serving specific interests and objectives. There are also different rules and regulations dependent on what kind of assets we are talking about, different constitutive and regulative rules to determine the functioning of different markets within the overall market economy. The real estate market, for example, does not only consist of land, piles of wooden boards and some cement, and a number of individuals who freely engage in monetary exchanges. The real estate market consists of lots of internal and external rules and regulations that determine how such economic transactions can take place, what can be traded and to whom, and what can be done with the acquired property. Besides stipulating what actually constitutes a piece of real estate, a good example of a constitutive rule on the real estate market is that buyers of property acquire very strong rights of ownership to their purchases through a title deed, the official registration of the real estate. However, that does not mean that one can necessarily do everything one desires with the newly acquired property. If I buy a building in central Stockholm, I might believe that I own it, that it is mine and that I can do with it what I want. But in certain cases, there are rules that limit what a buyer can do. For instance, I cannot move into the property myself if all the flats are already rented out. In Stockholm, there are regulative rules stipulating that the tenants living in my property have the right to remain as long as they wish, provided they in turn follow the rules of the lease. And if they wish to move, they can swap their flat for someone else's so that a person unknown to me moves into my building. In addition, I am not allowed to build an extension to the property unless the plans are approved by the city council. Also, if I purchase a property in the historical centre, I certainly cannot tear down the building I just bought. The real estate market thus consists of a number of rules to ensure the rights of tenants, the decisions of city planners, and the preservation of collective cultural goods, rules that make this particular market different from other markets. The book market is another good example. Suppose I go to a bookshop and buy a book. I pay and leave the shop with a book, thinking I now rightfully own it. And yet, I do not actually own the contents of the book. The book's copyrighted material is owned by the publisher or the author, or sometimes even the author's grandchildren. The publisher's and the author's mutual contract of ownership might also entail that the author cannot do whatever they want with the text after publication. Whether it is the publisher or the author who owns the contents depends upon their often very complicated agreements and the copyright rules applying in the country of publication. What I have paid for is merely the right to read the book. In some cases, the right to copy a few quotes in my own work if I make a formal reference to the original, but not to copy the entire book and sell it or even make it freely available online. The book market thus contains a number of particular rules that have been created to safeguard the interests of authors and publishers that differ fundamentally from those of other products. Very few commodities and services are freely exchanged on the market without any rules or regulations. It is debatable how reasonable many of these are, but the idea of an entirely free market quickly appears dubious under closer scrutiny. For instance, what would a free market for real estate look like? How would this market function if there were no regulations to protect property owners from the damage to their property value caused by a neighbour constructing a noisy and polluting factory next to them, by a high-rise building depriving them of sunlight, or by razing a historical landmark? Or how should the rental market work at all if the previous contracts were rendered null and void by the transition to a new owner? Similarly, what would the book market look like without copyright? Could this market exist at all without the protection of intellectual property? Different commodities simply require different rules in order to function on the market at all. Other examples that can be mentioned are medication, foodstuff, or construction. What would a free market without any regulations regarding the safety of drugs, foods, or electrical installations look like? If we were to remove all rules and regulations, there would be nothing left to call a market. We often take the constitutive systems of rules for granted and do not realize how arbitrary these human-made systems are and to what degree they influence how the market behaves. But we must realize that the market in itself not only contains a lot of rules, but in a sense is a collection of rules. We should therefore ask ourselves where these rules come from and whose purpose they serve. The pivotal question is then whose rules shall control the market and whose interests shall take precedence. Those of the company, the executives, the shareholders, the employees, the consumers, the state, future generations. We simply need rules to protect the interests of as many as possible. An entirely free market, one without any regulations, does not entail more freedom overall. On the contrary, the freedom of one person often entails less freedom for someone else. The freedom of property owners to evict their tenants for no particular reason violates the tenant's freedom from being made homeless, and the freedom to copy and freely distribute the contents of others' books violates the freedom of authors from having their intellectual property stolen. Similarly, the freedom of manufacturers to make products any way they like is likely to violate the consumer's freedom from bodily harm. Removing all regulations and believing it will lead to absolute freedom is simply not feasible. We always have to consider a large number of complex variables and carefully determine how we should regulate the system in order to achieve the most benevolent end results. The market's two invisible hands. Different rules will yield different results on the self-organized market, both in terms of the number of commodities that are produced and how they are distributed. We should therefore strive towards designing the rules so that they maximize productive efficiency while also ensuring a distribution of wealth that is perceived as fair. Once the constitutive rules are optimal, there may still be a need to introduce regulative rules, but then in such a way that the loss of efficiency that often comes with regulative rules can be kept to a minimum. Admittedly, this is not an easy task. There are no clear answers to how we reach the perfect balance between these two aspects, especially not in an ever-changing world in which yesterday's solutions become inefficient tomorrow. In football, for example, we want the game to be dynamic and exciting, but we also need it to be considered fair. Even if the offside rule may limit the efficiency with which players can score goals, it is necessary to prevent them from breaking the game by using the same exploitative tactic over and over again. Similarly, in order to ensure that people consider the market system fair, we need certain regulations to prevent the strong from exploiting the system at the expense of the weak. If football is not seen as fair, it ceases being a game. If the market economy, which has become such an integral part of our society, is seen as too unfair, if people do not experience that it serves their interests, they will eventually rise against the system and seek to demolish it. This can have very unfortunate consequences if there are no alternatives to replace it. If we think football is unfair, we may merely refuse to play along and do something else. But if we refuse to play along with existing market rules, we may succumb to a severe case of game denial, denying that there will always be a game among humans regarding economic transactions, given the fact that resources and opportunities remain limited. Everyone cannot get everything, which means that we need game rules to determine what we are allowed to do to acquire these finite resources. Game denial regarding the market can make the efficiency aspect disproportionately neglected in favor of equality, which can then lead to increased poverty, corruption, and often violence. Soviet communism and most recently the catastrophic developments in Venezuela are sad reminders of this. As such, it is better that we seek to regulate the current market in a way that ensures the optimal balance between efficiency and fairness. To do so, it is critical that we do not see market forces as given by nature, understand that Adam Smith's invisible hand is not that of God's, but something we can alter to deliver more desirable results. Indeed, It would assist our understanding of the market as a self-organizing system if we were to expand Smith's metaphor to comprise two invisible hands, one that bakes the pie and one that divides it. The first hand takes care of the non-zero-sum game regarding economic efficiency, the mechanisms responsible for baking as large and beautiful a pie as possible. When it comes to this invisible hand, all of us are more or less on the same side. Everyone wants a large and beautiful pie from the oven of the market. As for the other hand, we all tend to desire a larger part of the pie for ourselves. Whether we are talking about corporate lobbying activists or the political parties serving the interests of low-income groups, they all strive to influence the market in ways that distribute a larger share of the total economic output to one group or the other. The way the market constantly balances out supply and demand so as to reach an equilibrium of maximum utility, as noted by Smith, is thus only one of its self-organizing mechanisms. The other is the way in which a large number of agents seek to influence who gets what. This happens in several ways, such as companies acquiring government contracts, influencing legislation in ways that benefit their particular business models, sometimes at the expense of competitors, or advocating lower corporate tax. And then there are others who seek to redistribute more resources to public welfare, increase taxes for the wealthy, or limit what can be privately owned. In simple terms, one hand bakes the pie, another slices it into pieces of varying sizes. Once we realize that the way the market functions is a result not merely of individual consumers' decisions, but also of joint political decisions about its rules, we can no longer hide behind the idea of a free market. It is we who must take responsibility for the outcomes in the market. Whatever it does, we allow its doing. If we understand this, questions arise about what we want the market to do and which rules we believe will make that happen. In the following, I will attempt to answer these questions and make a couple of suggestions as to how we could make the market produce more desirable outcomes if we changed some of its rules. Towards a better market. Planned economies succumbed to bureaucratic inefficiency because planning became too complex. To be able to make decisions in a planned economy, the decision-makers must have sufficient knowledge of all supply and all demand and be able to balance these out without sacrificing too much efficiency. This rapidly proved an all too complex task to handle towards the end of the 20th century. The market economy has shown more endurance, but will the market economy too succumb because of the economy becoming too complex? Is it possible that the self-organizing mechanisms of the current market model, which in the past proved capable of matching the increasing complexity of the world, will eventually fail at handling the hyper-complex society of the future? Under favorable circumstances, the invisible hands will organize the market in a way that reaches the optimal balance between supply and demand on one hand and efficiency and fairness on the other. But there is no invisible hand, other than the lobbyists, that helps the politicians create the best rules to govern the market. How regulation is affected by the continuous flow of information provided by numerous lobbying actors demanding new rules is a self-organizing system. But the political process itself is not self-organizing. What is decided or not decided as a result of this process does not automatically guarantee that the rules reaching the best compromise between society's many different special interest groups will be implemented. Neither does it guarantee that the system as a whole manages to successfully accommodate the increasing complexity. If we fail at making the appropriate political decisions, we will risk that the market degenerates into a lower level of functionality, just like when the communist planned economy succumbed to the growing demands of handling higher levels of complexity. However, with the market system, it will probably not translate into empty store shelves in the near future. Rather, the contrary seems more likely to happen, an increased surplus of products that we do not really need and that we waste precious ecological and social resources on. Today, however, there is no alternative system to outcompete a degenerated market like the market economy of the West outcompeted the planned economy in the East. Had planned economics been without competition from an already existing alternative, it would probably still be around, albeit even more inefficient. Cultural evolution often requires competition to advance at a faster pace. But where is the competition to our current market model? Would we be persuaded to deal with the market's problems without competition from an already existing, better functioning market system? Will we bother to realize and deal with the problems of the market before we have used up our entire social and ecological capital? We simply do not know yet, but the lack of competition may prevent us from evolving fast enough. If we do not react in time, we risk reaching a point where we have consumed all the resources needed for a soft transition to a sustainable economy, with the end result that there won't even be any stores to contain the products that we no longer manage to produce. In the following, I will present a few examples of how we might improve upon the current market system in order to, among other things, make it more sustainable. As mentioned, the market consists of a number of internal and external rules and regulations that govern what the market is allowed to do. The question is how we relate to these and what we want them to accomplish. One way of preventing the market from creating things we do not want is by introducing bans on certain goods and services. Historically, however, this has often proved quite a malicious path. Prohibition often creates even greater economic incentives for those who are willing to defy the ban. Since prohibition decreases the number of people willing to supply a certain commodity, the profits to be made grow that much larger. And given the risks associated with breaking the law, those who choose to do so can demand a comparably higher price for their commodities to compensate for this, thereby increasing the profitability of the enterprise even further. The prohibition of alcohol in the United States in the 1920s is a good example of how bad things can go when a completely unregulated underground market emerges as a response to a national ban on a highly sought-after commodity. It created major problems in terms of organized crime, violence, and gangster bosses who gained as large an economic influence as many major corporate executives. A better alternative is to try to change market forces by altering rules so as to attempt to generate more preferable outcomes. Lobbying organizations have long understood that the outcome of the market is shaped by its rules, and as activists and social entrepreneurs, there is no shame in acquiring inspiration from their work methods. In this regard, the lobbying activities of the financial, pharmaceutical, and media industries in the US can be particularly insightful. Various lobbying organizations have long been highly successful in influencing political decision-makers in various ways, not least through endowments, in the hope of sparking congressional decisions that serve corporate special interests. And since these conspiracies rarely become known to the public, the small risk of losing goodwill among the electorate has often left politicians willing to play along. I am, of course, not arguing that these corporate lobbying organizations are paragons, or that their activities amount to fair play, merely that we could learn from those who have actually changed how the market works. It is important that we realize, as the economic power elite already has, that it is crucial to change market forces so that they will be working for whatever we want to attain. Going against the market is rarely a productive strategy. The corporate lobbying strategies have proved so successful that they should serve as inspiration for those who want to change the market for the good of humankind. In this regard, there are a number of areas in which we could direct our lobbying efforts that I will present in the following. What we could do differently. Copyright. In the case of copyright, there is an unfortunate discrepancy between the societal value of intellectual and cultural assets and that of their market value. For instance, if the media industries in Hollywood only had 10 years of copyright applying to their products, their profits would definitely be reduced, but not very much. A film earns 80% of its revenue during the first 5 years after its theatrical release. With films freely available after 10 years, the societal benefit would, on the other hand, increase significantly. A cultural profit at the consumer level would thus translate into increased societal value. One problem, however, is that our current bookkeeping systems only measure market value through the one-sided profit in the production and distribution chains. The benefit or damage that arises outside of these is not measured. Such gains and losses are termed positive and negative externalities in the standard economic model, in which they are seen as merely a disturbance to the equilibrium model. If an asset becomes freely available to consumers and the producers cease making profits from it, as when a film's copyright expires and the film falls into public domain, the desktop model of the economic system will report a loss in revenue in the economy as a whole. But the gains to the public will not be accounted for anywhere in our current economic measurements. It is merely apprehended as a loss in the corporate sector. For society as a whole, it is actually accounted for as a reduction in GDP. This, however, does not have anything to do with a loss in economic utility. That people profit from the cultural asset without monetary transactions, which is the only thing our current models measure, is simply considered irrelevant. The consequence is that something that increases societal value only receives negative headlines in the reports that are issued. Lower profits, lower GDP, and thus an apparent deterioration of the economy. But only on paper. The fact that society has been enriched beyond what can be measured in monetary terms is not accounted for, and is therefore not visible in bookkeeping. It is the same with natural assets. Neither environmental degradation nor the availability of non-commercial natural areas for recreational activities make their way onto the desks of most contemporary economists. As negative externalities, our own and future generations' common costs of harm to the environment will not be included in these calculi. If we could see societal gains in a larger perspective and made the copyright period shorter, it might also lead to further added value elsewhere. Other companies, consumers, and artists would gain access to material for creative reuse and further alteration much sooner. Freely mixing the cultural accomplishments of long-deceased geniuses with old and new material, copying and pasting bits and pieces of our recent cultural heritage into new contexts, and altering existing masterpieces in ways that make us see them from a new perspective, which already characterizes the explosion of new creativity in burgeoning internet cultures, would definitely add to the overall level of creativity in society and thereby increase these works' societal value. There are many era-defining songs and melodies, iconic film and literature characters, and fictional universes that play as large a role in our public imagination as the works of Homer did to the ancient Greeks, but unfortunately will remain copyrighted material for a considerable time. Currently, a copyright expires 70 years after the death of its creator, and for works of corporate authorship, 120 years after creation or 95 years after publication, whichever is earlier. This, however, is likely to be extended even further due to corporate interests. The Disney Corporation has successfully lobbied for an extension of the copyright period every time Mickey Mouse has been close to entering public domain. As a result, much of what has been produced during the 20th century remains the intellectual property of large media companies or the descendants of dead artists. In terms of societal value, this is rather unfortunate. Our shared culture does not only consist of century-old classics. The Bildung of our times consists just as much of more recent editions. Many of the cultural references that have made their way into our common symbol world today stem from popular culture of the last century. Star Wars and Mickey Mouse, Elvis and the Beatles, these are just a few examples of cultural phenomena that have become an integrated part of our culture, and thereby just as important to be acquainted with as Odysseus and Mozart. These treasures give us a shared language by enabling us to use cultural references to express what we mean. Since others know the very same symbols, characters, and narratives, things that would otherwise be hard to put into a single sentence can be more easily conveyed and with greater accuracy. If someone asks us to use the Force and not be tempted by the dark side, or if they say that a particular societal development resembles George Orwell's 1984, those of us who know the Bildung of today immediately know what they mean. References like these can help us articulate complex matters in simple terms, since we can make use of all the nuances and intricate meanings of these works. Unfortunately, we cannot use the fictional character of Darth Vader or use explicit references to the Ministry of Truth in our own work without risking being sued by the Disney Corporation or the copyright holders of Orwell's bibliography, the latter of whom recently sued a person for printing 1984 is already here on some T-shirts. But imagine if the same applied to the works of Homer. How would Greek culture have evolved if the ancient Greeks were forced to pay royalties to the great-grandchildren of Homer every time they used the Iliad and the Odyssey? Their culture would probably have been somewhat poorer if our current copyright laws had applied back then. So what could we do to improve the system? First of all, copyrights should be much shorter than they are today. Generally, they should not last long after the death of the copyrighted material's creator. Another possibility is that we make different rules depending on what kind of product we are talking about and who is producing them. Independent authors and books could enjoy longer-lasting copyrights, bigger corporations and blockbuster movies comparable shorter ones. This would protect the livelihood of intellectually significant writers and increase the societal value of having a large number of movies freely available to the public, respectively. In addition, the state could charge companies for the service of protecting their intellectual property, which can be a costly endeavor to the state when big companies use the courts to prosecute people who have violated their copyrights. What we could do differently: limited companies. The particular way our corporate laws and many internal rules in large companies are articulated may appear self-evident and logically necessary. However, they are more contingent than they initially appear. Since many companies use the same internal rules to govern their decision-making processes, it is tempting to suggest that they do so out of necessity. But, on closer scrutiny, they are often shaped by rather arbitrary historical processes and tend to depend on customs and conventions rather than case-specific considerations. As shareholders, for instance, we usually have the right to exercise our influence once every year. But why exactly should this depend on how many days it takes for the Earth to do a lap around the Sun? In some cases, it could actually be preferable to do this more often or make it an ongoing process. Just because the merchants in Venice during the Italian Renaissance thought it was appropriate to gather to make decisions each spring does not mean that this should also be the case in all situations today. Our corporate laws have emerged from historical coincidences and particular conditions in the past, but we are actually free to redesign them if we like. Indeed, it would probably be advantageous if we did. In the course of centuries, the legal entity of a limited company that we have today emerged from the needs of balancing the interests of governments, those of the public, and that of creating financial security and incentives for investments. Sometimes one of these priorities took primacy, sometimes another. The company has evolved through a number of different societal conditions that it had to be adapted to, from the guild system of the late medieval period, over the mercantilist economy of the colonial era, to the industrial factory economy of the 19th century. At every era, changes were made in order to compromise between the interests of the state, civil society, and capital owners. During the mercantilist age, a corporation could own slaves and employ troops to occupy large tracts of land in foreign countries. This model was then abandoned during the industrial age, when civil society's concerns with the liberty of individuals led to the abolition of slavery, and the state's need for security and stability made the government take over the trading corporation's territorial possessions. Today, a corporation cannot own human beings, employ soldiers, or invade foreign countries. We take that for granted, but history teaches us that it could be different, which obviously inhibits the extent of corporate interests over those of others. But it has been a long time since there have been any substantial changes to the way we legally define a company. It is basically the same construct as the one we had in the industrial age, albeit the companies we have today are much larger and sometimes even more powerful than states. This obviously begs the question whether a more successful compromise could be reached if we re-envisioned the limited company today. The unbalanced emphasis on profit motives and the narrow interests of capital owners written into the legal structure of our banks and other limited companies were largely responsible for the financial crisis. But if the modern corporation had evolved more closely from the manufacturing and trading companies of the medieval guild system, and thus had come to be governed by constitutive rules that prioritized the interests of other stakeholders, we could have seen a very different historical trajectory in which crises such as the one in 2008 would have been unlikely to occur. Another historical coincidence that could have been different is the curious case of legal personhood for companies. That such artificial entities are legally equal to that of natural persons is far from self-evident. In fact, most people tend to be surprised by this circumstance the first time they hear about it, since it is rather counterintuitive that natural persons are not considered legally above companies. It is thus easy to imagine an alternative historical development where the rights of individuals enjoyed higher protection vis-à-vis companies. If so, this could, for instance, have led to a higher proportion of cases where courts ruled in favor of individual humans rather than companies. There is also a significant discrepancy between the legal repercussions applying to natural persons and corporate personhoods. If humans break the law, they can get a prison sentence with severe personal consequences as a result. If a company breaks the law, it mainly risks financial penalties, which can often be worth it. Even if managers can get prison sentences if they go against the law, the financial incentives of their company can be so great that they are encouraged to take the risk nevertheless, with the prospect of considerable legal assistance from expensive lawyers and support from government officials on the company's payroll in case they get caught. Since companies have far greater capabilities of circumventing the legal system than natural persons, it is not unreasonable to demand that legislation should attempt to accommodate this fact by setting higher standards for companies and imposing more severe penalties when they break the law. I am not advocating that we should necessarily make all of these changes to the current system, merely that it is possible to imagine that corporate law could have been different if history had taken a different course. Some of these examples could serve as inspiration for improvements. There are, however, some amendments that I believe could provide more efficiency and justice to the current system. 1. Other stakeholders than owners and creditors should be given legal consideration and rights in limited companies. If employees and the local community were given voting rights and representation on the board of directors, the decision-making process would be likely to serve the interests of more people. And if societal concerns were written into corporate law and better balanced in relation to that of the profit motives of creditors and shareholders, the risks of societally important facilities being dismantled or government resorting to bailouts would be smaller. 2. The introduction of other types of bottom lines beyond the purely financial, for instance, a social and an environmental one. If a company has a very negative bottom line in terms of social responsibility and ecological sustainability, it should be subjected to external control and demands for change in the same way a negative financial bottom line does in relation to its creditors. If all companies were expected to present a positive social and ecological bottom line, the companies who emphasize these would not be at a competitive disadvantage in relation to those who do not. 3. Shareholders should be given greater influence and extended obligations, such as keeping the board accountable for ensuring that production is socially and environmentally sustainable, that the company upholds its ethical codex, and that the company upholds its responsibilities to the local community. 4. Limited companies' status of personhood should be restricted and made secondary to that of natural persons. Companies should still be treated as single legal entities, but this should not entail the same rights as those of individual citizens, such as the right to influence politics, unrestricted freedom of expression, or liberty to always do with their property as they please. Since large companies have overwhelmingly more power than individual citizens, It can endanger our democracy if we give them the same rights. A system in which the rights of natural persons are above those of artificially conceived legal entities could balance out the disproportionate power of corporations in favor of the former. 5. Finally, we should create a number of new legal corporate forms that better encourage social entrepreneurship, sustainability, and other purposes than profit alone. The current system primarily favors organizations that are either driven by profit incentives or purely devoted to charity. There is little legal consideration for those in between. But since many of the companies with the greatest prospects of fostering higher social and ecological sustainability are a kind of hybrid organization, legislation should be adapted to better accommodate their particular needs. Many companies that, strictly speaking, are not non-profit organizations are still founded on other purpose-driven principles than profit and managed by decision processes such as sociocracy and holacracy, involving more stakeholders than traditional profit-driven companies. Often, they also contain alternative notions of ownership. These kinds of companies currently have very little support in legislation. Changing corporate law in ways that gave such company forms higher legal recognition and protection, made them easier to register, and institutionalized their principles, could assist the transition to more socially responsible and ecologically sustainable business models. What we could do differently: taxation. All economists agree that taxes have negative effects on the efficiency of the market. In my view, it would therefore be better to make the market outcome different at the outset. By doing so, we would also avoid the feeling of something rightfully deserved being taken from us. The reason for the existence of taxation is, of course, that the acquisition of economic assets with military means, basically robbing people, was the only way for the rulers of the past to fill the state coffers. We have merely inherited this system, and the principle is the same. If you don't pay your taxes, the state's monopoly on violence will make sure that you do. Yet if we defined the market better from the start, we would not need as extensive a redistribution system as the one we have now. Our Stone Age brains would then not make us feel robbed of something considered honestly earned. It is unwise to go against human psychology, although we may be irrational. So even if it technically does not make much difference whether we receive a large sum to begin with, only to pay back a proportion later, or whether we receive a smaller sum without the need for further redistribution, in psychological terms, it is always preferable to aim for the latter. Income taxation could be replaced by a system in which the state derived its revenue from property rights. For example, if all natural resources were considered the shared property of every citizen. All exploitation of natural resources, anything from oil extraction to air pollution, would then incur a fee. A similar system already exists in the U.S. state of Alaska, whose inhabitants are considered the joint owners of the state's oil resources, receiving an annual dividend accordingly. A similar principle could, if the political will is available, be implemented to encompass all of our limited natural resources. Another source of revenue could be that of fees on copyrights, as previously mentioned. As consumers, we could also be charged for our use of natural resources when we purchase physical products and properties. This does in fact exist in most countries in the form of value-added tax, VAT, and yearly property taxes. The advantage of taxing people when they purchase a product is that it does not cause the same psychological penalty as income taxation. If the state derived a larger share of its revenues from VAT on physical products and to a lesser degree from income tax, it would probably make the taxation system more frictionless and thereby increase society's overall economic efficiency. It could even improve ecological sustainability and increase employment. Higher VAT would entail higher prices on physical products, and lower income tax would lower the price on human labor. In this way, it could become more cost-efficient to pay people to repair and renovate old products rather than to buy new ones. The environment would benefit greatly, and people struggling to find manual employment in our current high-tech information economy would get new opportunities to make a living. This development could be further encouraged by higher VAT on environmentally damaging products and lower VAT, if any, on services. Higher property tax is another source of income that could compensate for the loss of revenue to the state if we were to abolish income tax. The advantage of taxing property is that it prevents a small number of property owners from enriching themselves at the expense of people with low incomes who actually pay a form of tax to the owners by paying rent. Higher property tax could thus ensure that a proportion of the property owner's profits came to serve the greater good. It would also encourage productive labour rather than speculation, since the gains of owning real estate would be that much lower. As a result, society would likely become more equal, with fewer people owning a disproportionately large share of all available property, while ambitious people would probably be more inclined towards using their skills and energy on more productive endeavours than speculating in real estate. Since the richest individuals primarily derive their wealth from property and not actual work, higher property tax could compensate for the relative inequality caused by lower income tax and higher VAT. Let us create a better market. It is impossible to imagine our current world without the market. The market is the primary engine of production and creativity, and its efficiency is central for our welfare and security. Every day we make political decisions that influence how the market works. These decisions should always be seen in relation to the three crucial aspects of society: efficiency, fairness, and meaning, so that we may ask ourselves the following. Efficiency. Are we using the market in the best conceivable way? Is the market the best tool in a particular case, or should we use a different one to better accomplish what we want to do? In simple terms, will the market be able to bake the pie? Fairness. What distributive effects will our decisions have? Who will be the winners and who will be the losers? Can we design the rules differently to create fewer losers? How will the market, given these new rules, divide the pie? Meaning. What other human values, aside from economic efficiency, do we strive for on a particular issue? Ecological and social sustainability, cultural enrichment, or perhaps existential meaning? And how do we safeguard these values? Will the pie look the way we wish when we take it out of the oven? If our political decisions regarding the market were based on informed discussions about its efficiency at carrying on particular tasks, how to make it generate fairer outcomes, and what exactly we want it to accomplish, we would be more likely to create a better functioning market. Decisions based on ideologically inclined convictions of being either for or against the market simply won't. Although I am critical of the market being allowed to penetrate parts of society where it does not belong, the secular market society still remains the best foundation from which to build a better future society, in my view. Even if there is a connection between the market and neoliberal postmodern emptiness, this does not mean it cannot be used for the good. In fact, it may be one of the most powerful tools at our disposal. 100 years ago, it was much easier to get an overview of the market economy than it is today. In those days, it was usually sufficient to think in terms of linearly conceived economic plans, where the most important variables were accounted for, and further economic development was more predictable. Central planning functioned fairly well for a time, but during the 20th century, the world became too complex for this to ensure efficiency. The Soviet Union collapsed for the very reason that their linear way of economic thinking no longer worked. The world had become too complex. The market economy has worked better at coordinating this complexity, but recently there have been signs that we are no longer guaranteed that it will organize itself to produce the most desirable outcomes. The economy is growing, albeit slower than before, but new technologies, a vast and uncontrollable global financial market, and burgeoning economies in the developing world have made it more difficult to create sufficiently well-considered economic policies. We also need to consider new phenomena such as climate change and the surprising insight that increased GDP does not automatically equal higher levels of satisfaction and continuous social advancement. There are truly more variables to consider in our hyper-complex global information society today than back when we could create a sufficiently accurate overview of the economy from the perspective of the industrial nation-state. As such, we need to increase our capacity to grasp and manage complexity above what we have previously been used to. There is currently a growing chorus of voices saying that liberal democracy no longer works. For many, it is clear that democracy in its present form has failed at fostering increased equality, that it no longer provides believable prospects of better opportunities for all, and that it cannot protect our natural environment from destruction. Others call for strong leaders who can take us back to a simpler world, where we do not need to worry about globalization, climate change, or refugees, and where we can find comfort in traditional family life and trusted national and religious identities. But there is no way back. We cannot rewind the clock and close our borders to the world, bring back the jobs in factories and mines, and once again make economic plans along the lines of the industrial nation-state, while we happily ignore the climate changes ravaging the Earth. Over 14 billion years, the complexity of our world has consistently increased and accelerated. It has always brought new challenges with it, and those who have not adapted in time have always succumbed to their inability to develop new complexity themselves. The market as we conceive it today is a myth that worked well in the industrial age, but it remains a social construction that we largely imagine, not an objective fact that could not be different. It is important that we become aware of this fact if we are to change it to better accommodate increasing complexity. In the same way that we could not leave the religious thought perspective behind us before a sufficient number of us started seeing God as a social imaginary that we ourselves had created, a larger proportion of the population in modern society needs to see the market as a similar socially constructed myth if we are to move forwards. When we do that, we can see it as an object for manipulation, rather than blindly experiencing it as an all-encompassing reality that we do not grasp we are mentally embedded in. Previously, society was a religion. Now we have a religion, or not. This is because we developed the ability to see it as an object rather than being embedded in it. Today, however, we still are a market economy. In the future, we could develop to the point where we have a market economy. But for this to happen, we need to see it from a mental distance, just like that of religion. Today, in particular, where there are no visible alternatives to the market, and market forces have come to penetrate ever more aspects of our lives and culture, this is getting increasingly difficult. That which just a few generations ago was still being debated and carefully institutionalized has now been firmly internalized in our shared symbol world to a degree that most do not remember that things could be any different. As such, it becomes harder to see the market as the arbitrary human construction it is. It has simply become a natural fact of life. It has become to us, as water is to the fish,